Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week we bring you leading nuclear deterrence experts for a lively discussion on current topics. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Deterrence Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Hi, welcome into the Advanced Nuclear Weapons Alliance NucleCast podcast. I am your host, Adam Lowther, Strategic Advisor to ANWA DC. Today's guest is Dr. Michaela Dodge, who is a research scholar at the National Institute of Public Policy. Now, I first met Michaela when she was a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation many moons ago. And in the years since, Michaela has gone on to earn her PhD and become one of the country's top nuclear weapons and deterrence experts. And with that, welcome into the show, Michaela.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now, last year, COVID 2020 that many of us would like to forget, we put together a book with some other folks on behalf of Air Force Global Strike Command and those interested in understanding the role of nuclear weapons and deterrence to try to explain what role deterrence plays and what role nuclear weapons play in protecting the nation. And in that book, you wrote a chapter that discussed budgeting and discussed the costs of nuclear weapons. And so on today's show, what I was hoping we could spend our time discussing is sort of giving listeners a comparative analysis of what nuclear weapons cost, what deterrence costs the country, and then what we can get out of it. What do they get for their money? And so with that, let me just ask you sort of the first question, and that would be, how can Americans better understand the costs of nuclear weapons in context?
It is very difficult to actually disentangle costs of nuclear forces, and that is due to several reasons. Some of the system, for example, our bombers, we use for conventional missions most of the time. Yet for the budgeting purposes, they're often counted as nuclear systems. It's similar goes for the F-35, which is conventional platform, but also will carry nuclear weapons. And so my advice would be to always look at assumptions in reports that clarify their assumptions, what they count and how and why. Now, what makes matters even more complicated is long time frames that nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons modernization entail. And of course, the longer the time frame, the more uncertain the estimate is. And so because of all of these factors, it is really easy to shape the story to one's preferred outcome. Now, I think the most important thing, though, is that context that you mentioned in your question. And the context is what it is that nuclear weapons provide for us, and how does it stack relative to other functions of the government and other funds that the government spends on the citizens' behalf. And I think undoubtedly, nuclear weapons forces spending is one of the most important outlines in the federal budget. That is because nuclear weapons are one of the very, very few weapons that can fundamentally change life as we know it in a very, very short period of time.
So as we think about budgeting, and we've seen, some studies that call it the $1 trillion triad and that focus on this 30-year cost and sort of condense it down into one budget number. For most Americans, $1 trillion seems like a lot of money. And as you think about this long-term spending, can you perhaps put it into a context that Aunt Sally in Iowa or Uncle Ron in Oregon can better understand in terms of what the government spends and what portion of that is spent on nuclear weapons. So, for example, I like to point out that Americans in any given year will spend more on chewing gum than they will on nuclear weapons. And I would argue, in my humble opinion, that nuclear deterrence and the security that provides is far more important to us than chewing gum. So, is there a way to put it in context for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we talk about the US federal budget, the Department of Defense portion of the federal budget is about 16% or so. It doesn't diverge that much. Out of that, nuclear weapons, both modernization and sustainment, will be 6.4% at the peak of nuclear modernization. Now, the example that I like to use is between the period between 2004 and 2019, the government paid out 1.2 trillion in improper payments, waste, fraud, and abuse. That's in 15 years, it improperly paid more than we will spend on nuclear modernization in the next 30 years. And I do know that $1 trillion is a lot of money, but the value we are getting in terms of preserving our way of life, in terms of upholding our alliance commitments, in terms of protecting our forward deployed troops, it's really immeasurable.
It's interesting to think about it in the sense that if you go back to World War II, so one of the things that we talk about nuclear weapons doing is that they prevent, or they have prevented for 70 plus years, great power wars. So there was no World War III with the Soviet Union. And we've reduced conflict and the sort of the severity of conflict over time. And if you go back to World War II and you look at what the federal government spent on the war effort, it was up to half of the total gross domestic product. So 50 cents on the dollar earned in this country during the war, during that time frame, were spent on war fighting. And I would argue that nuclear weapons have allowed us to reduce total defense spending because we're not fighting those types of wars. What say you?
Yeah, absolutely. And not only that, but early on, nuclear weapons were a much larger portion of the Department of Defense's budget. So, in the 50s, I think it was somewhere around half of the Department of Defense's budget went to nuclear weapons programs. Our last modernization cycle was during the Reagan era, and back then it was about over 8%, if I recall correctly. So we really are not thinking about dramatic numbers. And just to think about, we've just passed more than 6 trillion in various capital infusions, thanks to the Wuhan origin coronavirus. Now, if you canceled the GBSD, the intercontinental range strategic missile replacement entirely, it would be 0.002% of the federal budget. It would be 0.003% of the projected federal spending and 0.002% of the spending to date on the pandemic. My colleague Tim Morrison at the Hudson Institute crunched numbers on that. And really, the benefit we are getting, the deterrence of a great power war, would be if we did not have that, it would be much more costly for the United States.
Well, one of the things that concerns me is many detractors, for example, of GBSD and of the nuclear arsenal in general. That one of the problems I have is that I'm concerned that conventional conflict becomes more prevalent. And if conventional conflict becomes more prevalent because we don't have an arsenal, and our adversaries perceive, if deterrence credibility is capability times will, and we have less capability and there is a perceived lack of will, and our adversaries begin to be more assertive and aggressive, I'm concerned that the amount of money we spend on defense goes up, and that the benefits that nuclear weapons have brought us by suppressing the amount that's required to spend on defense because we're not fighting wars, that we lose that very benefit.
I mean, clearly any deterrence failure would be much, much more costly than any sort of temporary benefit we would derive from cutting GBSD or cutting Columbia class or whatever it is. America can afford survival, as Secretary of Defense James Mattis said in his time. Uh, Really, defense spending is a no-brainer. It's one of the primary constitutional obligations of the federal government. It is incredibly important for us to posture ourselves credibly to deter war in the face of increasing aggression and belligerence of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and just much more complex security environment than we faced in the past. Now, this is not to say that it was easy to deter the Soviet Union, because it wasn't. But I think partly we forget how difficult it was to deter the Soviet Union, and in our minds we paint this picture of sort of automatic, mutually assured destruction deterrence that didn't quite work. We were lucky that the Cold War ended when it did. And in the meantime, we forgot the lessons that we learned, the good lessons we learned during the Cold War.
Now, at this point in the show, I want to go ahead and take a break. We're at about the halfway point. So stick with us, Michaela, and we'll be right back.
This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence.
All right, and we're back, and we're with Michaela Dodge of the National Institutes of Public Policy. So before the break, we were talking about the benefits of nuclear weapons. Now, I want to posit to you sort of my perspective and see what your take on it is. Now, as I think about nuclear weapons spending, and I go back all the way to Eisenhower and the New Look policy, and the idea was that if we spent on nuclear weapons, we would deter great power conflict. And in deterring great power conflict, we would deter conflict between the allies and partners of great powers. And essentially, we push the quantity and scope of conflict down. And then what that allows the United States to do is it allows us to shift where we spend our gross domestic product from fighting wars. And like I said earlier, we spent half of the gross domestic product during World War II on the war effort. And so therefore, we get to do things like research and development. And we get to focus, we have lower taxes. And with lower taxes, American citizens can buy, like I drive a beautiful blue Ford F-150 off-road edition. That's great in snow, great in the mountains. Now, if the United States were constantly fighting wars, I might have to pay higher taxes that would prevent me from buying that beautiful truck and the nice house I live in. And I might not have this thing in my pocket that I can pull out and I can ask this little device I've got any question and it will give me the answer to it. And I can even talk to people on the other side of the world in an instant. And so if we were spending on constant wars and on, particularly great power wars, the money might not have been there to go and develop all of those other things that are now part of American life. And so as I look at nuclear weapons, and I really try to look at the effects they've had over the last 70 years, I'm actually quite thankful that they were there because of what I attribute their success to be, which is deterring all of those wars that would have taken treasure and American blood. And so I think they've done a great job. Now, am I wrong about that?
I don't think you're wrong. I think you might need to pay higher taxes anyway because of Medicare and Social Security and all of those entitlements. But, back to deterrence and US nuclear posture, I think the disagreement we're having today, which is disagreement we've had for pretty much since the dawn of the nuclear age, is how much is enough. And we have, since the end of the Cold War, we have been reducing and we have been hoping that we will realize additional benefits of nuclear force reductions and not having to pay for it, and others will follow our leadership. Remember when the first post-Cold War nuclear posture review was written, the overarching theme was lead but hedge. We've done a lot of leading. We've reduced over 90% of our short-range nuclear weapons, over 80% of our long-range nuclear weapons. We haven't done much by the way of hedging. Our infrastructure is in crumbles. We cannot produce a new nuclear weapon on any sort of reasonable, flexible time frame today, despite the fact that Russia and China have been bolstering and improving their nuclear weapon capabilities. And at some point, and I'm afraid that we're approaching that point pretty fast, we have to start thinking about nuclear deterrence and nuclear and what our adversaries are doing and what it means for our posture seriously. We are not in a position to continue to ignore capabilities that Russia and China have been building up in the past 20 years.
So one of the things that we have to think about with nuclear weapons is, of course, credibility. And with credibility, we get that through capability and will. And so you've discussed the Chinese and Russian modernization programs compared to our sort of slow response. Now, I would argue that we have diminishing capability, and I think you've talked about the nuclear weapons complex and some of the challenges that are there. And that goes to the capability side of the house. And then I would argue that there's a will side of the house where we're experiencing significant challenges relative to Russia and China in particular. How has our reluctance to modernize and this fight over whether we will modernize or not, how do you think that has had a potential effect on the perceptions of the Russians and the Chinese in viewing our own willingness to be a nuclear power, and if push came to shove, to use those weapons?
I think what we are seeing is a general unwillingness of democratic governments to think seriously about war and about preparations for war. And it is something that we have been seeing in the course of US history. completely unprepared for the outbreak of the First World War, almost negligently unprepared for the outbreak of the Second World War. And we had to mobilize, we had to pay in blood and treasure to come and save the world order that was beneficial or has been beneficial to us and to most countries around the world. Um, and, I worry that it is the repeat of that pattern. I worry whether we will have time to mobilize in the nuclear age should deterrence fail and should we have another outbreak of a great war. Um, but I just, we will have to see. I do think that leaders of foreign countries, um, there is nothing like certainty. They will not be able to predict how the United States will respond to a situation X, Y, and Z, and we may not be able to predict that either, because it's very situation dependent. Or they might predict that the United States will get involved and will mobilize, and they may not care anyway, like the Japanese didn't care after attacking the Pearl Harbor. And because there is that potential for deterrence to fail, we should think about our posture, what happens if deterrence fails, and how we can fight the war in an intelligent manner and end the conflict on terms favorable to us, however unsavory such thoughts might be. All of these considerations should feed into our future nuclear modernization plans. So we shouldn't be doing just what we have always done because we have always done it, but we should really think about what it means that we are facing these new adversaries, that we are facing new complex challenges, what it means for our nuclear weapons programs, what it means for our defensive programs, perhaps more importantly than our nuclear programs. It's a very difficult problem, and I think we will struggle. And I don't have full confidence that we will be successful figuring it out until it's almost too late.
Well, the United States does, as you point out, have a history of being responsive instead of proactive. And I think you're right that it's an aspect of a democracy that democracies tend not to want to fight. They want to pursue life, liberty, and happiness instead of fighting wars. But as you do point out, also we do step up. We step up late. We try to modernize nuclear arsenals or our nuclear arsenal. We have an arms control community that does not support nuclear modernization. And I've heard, both in their public statements and then, of course, in the writings of the arms control community, they argue that the cost is just unaffordable. And they point out that it'll be over $1 trillion over the next 30 years to both modernize and sustain the nuclear enterprise. Now, this to me, it seems like a farcical argument, particularly given that we've spent, just in the period of COVID, we've spent more than $4 trillion on programs that in many respects, they never went to their intended beneficiaries. And so if we can easily spend $4 trillion in just over a year, and then, of course, on average, the federal budget before COVID was pushing $5 trillion a year. Why is it that the arms control community consistently tries to suggest that nuclear modernization is something that the U.S. federal government and the American taxpayer cannot afford?
I do not know. Obviously not being a member of the arms control community, I wouldn't want to speak on its behalf. But, the truth of the matter is, If somebody asked Americans, would you be willing to spend $5 trillion over 30 years to keep your way of life, or face the alternative of being bullied by Russia and China into a national security position that supports everything else, that supports our trade, that supports freedom of seas, that supports satellites we send into outer space that are incredibly important for our commercial sector. I mean, Americans are common sense people. Of course, they'd want to look dangerous enough to be left alone to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Similarly, if you ask them, hey, are you willing to be hostages to North Korea, Iran, Russia, or China? They would say, no, of course not. We want the best missile defense we can.
So as we come to the end of the show, as we've talked a lot about budgeting, and we've talked a lot about the role of the nuclear arsenal, and we've talked about modernization. What advice would you give advocates of modernization who think that what we plan to spend over the next 3 decades is well worth the cost? What advice would you give them for making arguments as they go home, as they depart, from Washington, D.C., where many of the folks are, as they go back to Iowa and they go back to Alabama and wherever else they may originally be from, and they talk to friends and they talk to relatives to try to explain what nuclear weapons do and why they're well worth it. Do you have any final parting advice for them?
Talk about the context, talk about the alternatives, an alternative world in which we do not have the benefit of nuclear deterrence, in which we do not have the benefit of freedom of action away from US shores to keep conflict there instead of on our homeland. Talk about other types of spending relative to what we are planning to spend on nuclear weapons modernization, and talk about the goodness that America's predominant position has spread around the world since the Second World War, not only for Americans, but for people in Europe, for people who enjoy benefits of trade and can participate in this global market that U.S. freedom upheld, freedom of action upholds.
Dr. Michaela Dodge, thank you again for joining us. This was an enlightening discussion. And I also want to thank the listeners, the Nuclecast listeners. Our next podcast, we are also, as you might guess, going to talk about nuclear weapons and nuclear modernization, but from a totally different perspective. So with that, thanks again, everyone. Michaela, it was a pleasure.